They hung her by her hair until her own scalp began to tear. The men questioning her wanted only one thing: the names of the partisans hiding in the mountains. She knew those names. She had carried their food, their messages, their lives in her hands, and she said nothing.
Welcome to the Black File. I'm the voice behind the file. And tonight, the file belongs to a woman almost no one outside Romania has ever heard of. Not a soldier, not a politician. A peasant woman from a village in the foothills of the Făgăraș Mountains, who chose silence under torture over the betrayal of men she loved.
Her name was Elisabeta Rizea, and before the end of her life, she would become one of the most enduring symbols of resistance her country has ever known. She was born on the 28th of June, 1912, in the Argeș region of southern Romania, in the world of the Nucsoara area, in the foothills of the Făgăraș Mountains. A peasant, a woman whose life was meant to be measured in seasons, in harvests, in the small distances between a village and the forest above it. There was nothing in her beginnings that marked her for history, no rank, no education that the regime would respect, no power of any kind. And that is precisely the point. When the test came, it did not come for a general or a statesman. It came for an ordinary woman in an ordinary village, and what she did with it would outlast every official who ever stood over her. But to understand her choice, you have to understand what was happening in those mountains. After the communist takeover at the end of the 1940s, Romania did not fall silent all at once. In the Carpathians, armed resistance groups formed. Small bands of men who refused to accept the new order and took to the mountains to fight it. In the Nucsoara and Musel area, one such group operated, known as the Haiducii Muselului, the outlaws or haiducs of Musel. It was led by Colonel Gheorghe Arsenescu and by Toma Arnautoiu, and it hid in the heights of the Făgăraș Mountains. These were not professional soldiers backed by an army. They were a handful of men holding out against an entire state in a country where every road, every village, every neighbor could be watched. To survive in those mountains, they needed the valleys below them. They needed people willing to risk everything to keep them alive. Elisabeta Rizea was one of those people. Her resistance did not come from a gun. It came from a basket of food, an open door, a message carried quietly from one hand to the next. Elisabeta Rizea supported the partisans in the most dangerous way a villager could. She fed them, she gave them shelter, she passed them information, and she acted as a courier between the men in the mountains and the world below. Think about what that meant, day after day. Every loaf of bread she carried up toward the tree line was a death sentence if she was caught. Every man she hid was proof in the eyes of the securitate that she was an enemy of the state. She had a life she could have protected by simply doing nothing, by looking away like so many were forced to. Instead, she chose the partisans. They came for her around 1949. She was arrested, and she was handed to the securitate, the communist secret police, who set out to make her talk. In her own later testimony, she described what they did. They beat her savagely, and they hung her, suspended by her hair, until the scalp tore from her head.
There was a purpose to every blow. They wanted her to name the men in the mountains. One word from her, a single name, and the pain could stop. The interrogators held all the power. She held only the names and the choice of whether to speak them. They had time, and they had cruelty, and they used both. She gave them nothing.
She was imprisoned and then released, but the regime was not finished with her. Around 1958, she was arrested again. By then, the resistance in the mountains had been betrayed and run to ground. The Arnaut Soyu group was captured in 1958, and its leaders were executed in 1959. The men she had protected were gone, and the state turned back to those who had helped them. In total, Elisabeta Rizea spent about 12 years inside communist prisons, places associated with women political prisoners, names like Misleya and Miercurea. 12 years, not for taking up arms, but for carrying bread and keeping silent. She was finally freed in 1964 in the general amnesty that emptied the regime's prisons of its political captives. She walked out, an old woman, into a country that pretended none of it had ever happened. For decades, her story stayed where the regime wanted it, hidden, unspoken, locked inside one old woman's memory. And then, after communism fell in 1989, the silence finally broke. In the 1990s, Elisabeta Rizea sat before a television camera and spoke. She recalled what had been done to her and why she had never betrayed the men in the mountains.
There was no rehearsed speech, no polished phrasing, only the plain, fearless words of a peasant woman who had stared down the securitate and kept her dignity intact. She did not speak to be praised. She spoke so it would not be forgotten. And a nation that had been taught for 40 years to look away suddenly found it could not look away from her.
From that testimony, an icon was born. The image was almost unbearable in its simplicity. An old peasant woman who had been hung by her hair, who had given 12 years of her life to communist prisons, who had stood against the entire machinery of a police state, and had won the only victory that was ever truly hers to win. She kept her silence. She did not betray a single name. In a century crowded with grand ideologies and powerful men, the resistance that endured in Romanian memory belonged to a villager with nothing but her conscience. She became a symbol of exactly that an ordinary person with no power at all can still refuse, that the smallest life can hold an unbreakable spine, that a regime can take your freedom, your body, even your scalp, and still fail to take the one thing you decide to keep. Elisabeta Rizea died on the 4th of October, 2003, an old woman at last, in a free country, decades after the men she protected had been buried in unmarked ground. The regime that tried to break her was gone. The securitate that tore her scalp was gone. And she was still there, until the end, with her name remembered, and her silence finally understood as the loudest thing she ever did. She was not a hero of speeches or of battles. She was a peasant who carried bread up a mountain, and who answered torture with a refusal that cost her 12 years and gave nothing in return to the men who demanded it. That is what she stands for now, the quiet, stubborn dignity of the powerless, the proof that conscience can outlast cruelty. They had every weapon, and she had only her word. She kept it. This is the file of Elisabeta Rizea. Take care of yourselves, my friends, and remember the ones who never talk.